way forward, but urgent action is needed. I continue to believe that the deal the government has negotiated is a good compromise that delivers on the referendum whilst protecting jobs and our security partnership with our EU friends and neighbours. I will give way to the honourable gentleman.
Leader flags for giving way, and whilst I disagree with her on the withdrawal agreement being a good compromise, would she agree that, first of all, any vote in this House today is indicative? And secondly, it would be totally unreasonable to expect any government to go and negotiate an arrangement which was totally at odds with the programme that the government set out, the manifesto commitments that the government made, and the arrangements which the people of the United Kingdom would accept.
Well, I think the honourable gentleman was reading my mind. I was literally just about to say that any alternative solution that the House votes for would need to be deliverable, it would need to be negotiable with the European Union, and it would also need to deliver on the vote of the referendum. And Members of Parliament, I don't want to give way any further because this is a day for Parliament. I do apologise. Members of Parliament should also be in no doubt Members of Parliament should also be in no doubt that any alternative solution requiring a further extension would mean the UK participating in European Parliament elections. After nearly 3 years since the referendum, I believe this position would be unacceptable to the people of the United Kingdom. The Government will continue to call for an agreement which delivers on the referendum of 2016 and maintains a deep and special partnership with the European Union. So, Mr. Speaker, I look forward to hearing the contributions made in today's debate and working with the House to agree a negotiable and deliverable way forward that respects the result of the referendum. Thank you.
Thank you. Angela Regal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hadn't intended to speak, but I think it's important, in the light of the comments that the Leader of the House has made, that at least somebody gets up and points out that our debate today is coming about simply because Parliament has tried to do something that the Prime Minister ought to have been doing 3 years ago, after the referendum passed, and namely to try to make some sense of what was a completely undefined way of trying to leave the European Union, which had divided our country. What we should have been seeing then, Mr. Speaker, and what today's business motion allows us to do, albeit at the very last minute, is to try to reach out and see if we can come together ourselves across Parliament, but also begin to think about ways which might be able to heal our deeply divided country. And it's been divided by a Prime Minister that insisted on dealing solely with her own extreme right-wingers to try to define what Brexit should be, rather than reach across the aisle in this House to try to bring about a compromise which could have taken more of the country with it. Now, I understand, Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the House's points about the constitutional novelty of the situation we're in, but I disagree with her hard-line view of what Parliament's role is, especially since the 2017 general election, which deprived her party of a majority in this House, and also taking into account this government's record in riding roughshod over the constitutional understandings that it wishes to, by ignoring opposition votes, by refusing to vote in the end in opposition motions, by defining the parliamentary session in 2 years, thereby taking away the opportunity for opposition days and halving them in number. There's a range of other ways in which this government... yes, I'm happy.
I'm very grateful to my friend for giving way on that point. Isn't it correct that if we look over the weekend at the announcements, that no votes in last week's indicative vote got anywhere near what the Prime Minister's deal got. But given that the government abstained on the votes last week, it was clearly going to have smaller numbers because the payroll weren't involved.
Yes, and Mr. Speaker, despite the payroll being in constant contention against itself, the payroll has grown over time. And so to not have the payroll voting does mean that, by definition, anything this House can vote on in the debates today is going to have lesser numbers. But we are close to reaching, I think, some conclusions, and it's almost like the Leader of the House doesn't want the House to reach conclusions, so she can try and have another go with meaningful vote 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and God forgive us, even 10. I give way to my
I thank my friend for giving way, and she makes very strong points, and I am too backing this Business of the House motion today, because I think actually Parliament made remarkable progress the other day. Actually, in a few hours, actually, compared to the government's had 2 years to try and sort this out. So, does she agree with me? It's very important that we vote this through, not only so that we have the opportunity tonight to further make progress, but also so that, if necessary, we have a small amount of time on Wednesday as well, that we get this there, Parliament takes control, and we move forward together as a House.
Well, I agree with my honourable friend. Indeed, if we were listening to those that campaigned to leave in the referendum, I thought it was all about taking back control for Parliament. But we found right from the beginning, as the Prime Minister attempted to exclude Parliament from having any decision-making process at all, and had to be dragged kicking and screaming by the Supreme Court to give Parliament the role that is its right. I think it's about time that we demonstrated to this dysfunctional government that there is a way forward that we can come to, and I hope that our deliberations will do so. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I am concerned that the government is going around saying that they won't listen to the results of indicative votes, and that's why it's important, albeit very difficult, for us as a Parliament to take even more time from the government so that we can begin to legislate if there's a result tonight. I think, given that the government has tried to keep this power to itself, has tried to exclude Parliament completely from having a say in the decisions that have been made post-referendum, we have to keep doing constitutionally novel things in order to try to save our country from the disaster of a catastrophic no-deal crash-out.
Sir Edward Lee. Mr. Speaker, in some ways this business motion might be seen to be the most interesting and important part of the day, because procedure now is everything. And the fact that on this historic day that the government has lost control of the order paper is vitally important now to this debate and how we proceed in future. Because although we're going to have a very interesting debate in the coming hours, I doubt if a single vote will be changed by what anybody says here, what blogs are made or what tweets are made. Most people have made up their mind, and they will have a settled view on what they want, whether it's a customs union or no deal or whatever. My few remarks really are almost by way of question to the Leader of the House and to my right honourable friend, the member for West Dorset. And I think, like many people, I really want to know what's going to happen now under this procedure. It seems to me that tonight we will probably whittle down matters just to one option, which has the most support in the House, and we all know that's probably likely to be permanent membership of the Customs Union. And then on Wednesday, my right honourable friend, the alternative government, not the Labour Party, but the other alternative government, my right honourable friend for West Dorset, will take control of the agenda, and as I understand it, he will then produce a bill to implement what probably then will be a permanent membership of the Customs Union. And I put this to the government. Us Conservative MPs will then have a choice then. We will either have to have permanent membership of the Customs Union because the order paper would have been taken over by the government, or we have a general election, or we prorogue Parliament. And I have to say to my right honourable friend that I think it would be a dereliction of duty on behalf of this House if we were to abdicate our responsibility and to have a general election. The people asked us to make this choice and do this job, and if we can't agree on what we don't want, we should agree on what we do want. And therefore the government really has to move forward with its meaningful vote, if necessary in a runoff with this Customs Union, if necessary in a vote tomorrow. So I do not believe that it is in the interest of the nation to have a general election, which solves nothing, because people don't vote on the issue. They vote on who is the leader of the party, or who they like, or who's their local MP. We all know that every single general election gets out of control. We ourselves have to decide this issue. We have to make the choice. We have to decide what we want, not what we don't want. And no, I'm going to finish in a moment. And the other thing we surely cannot do, and I say this to my friends who, like me, voted for Brexit, you cannot duck the issue by proroguing Parliament. You can't act like Charles I. We voted leave because we wanted to give control back to Parliament. And it's like throwing the football out of the stadium because you're losing the football match. So there is a simple choice for my colleagues now. We are on the cusp of the government losing control and us facing permanent membership of the customs union, which runs contrary to our manifesto. And therefore we have to get real, dear friends, and we have to make that choice. And my personal choice is I would rather vote for the Prime Minister's deal, which at least delivers some sort of Brexit.
Order. Can I just very gently say to colleagues that although there is a time scheduled for this debate, some of the points being made are points that could perfectly well be made in the debate itself rather than in the debate on the business of the House motion. So I would have thought colleagues could speak extremely briefly, to be brilliantly exemplified now, I think, by Mr Gareth Snell.
To do my best, Mr Speaker. I simply wish to touch on my amendment that was not selected, Mr Speaker. Of course, I pay ultimate deference to your decision, but I wonder if at some point before we move before the vote on this motion, whether the Honourable Member for West Dorset could help me. When we discussed the business of the House motion last week, I asked him about the daisy chaining process he was involved in of attaching another day to the day's business of the day we're discussing. We now have a motion that we passed on the 25th to have a debate on the 27th to give us the 1st to give us the 3rd. I have no issue, Mr Speaker, with this House doing what it sees necessary to find a way through this Brexit impasse. But I do wonder, Mr Speaker, whether, if he has one, the Honourable Member for West Dorset could actually tell us what his plan is going forward. There is rumour that on Wednesday we may be asked to legislate for the outcome of this evening. I presume on Wednesday's business of the House motion there will be another paragraph 2 to commandeer a day of the week after. And if that's the case, Mr Speaker, I just wonder whether, if there exists somewhere, a plan of how many days and what those days are to be used for that can be shared with this House. Not because I wish to impede the House from doing that, but on Friday I was asked to vote against the withdrawal agreement on the basis of a blind Brexit. But I'm now being asked to hand over days of parliamentary business with no idea what will be tabled and discussed on those days. And I would... And as much as I thank the benches opposite for their support, I don't really want it. The simple... I mean, I'll take it, but I don't want it. The point I would like... And I do wonder whether... And I do mean this from a point of trying to be helpful to Honourable Gentleman from West Dorset. If he does have a plan of how many days and what those days are to be used for, could he share it with us? Because I think as a House, if we're going to be asked to hand over day after day, we should know what we should be asked to vote on those days.
Sir William Cash.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. A few days ago, Mr Speaker, I brought in a bill entitled a bill, the House of Commons Precedents of Government Business European Withdrawal Act Bill, which I gave a great deal of thought to and discussed with many other members, is due to be debated on the 5th of July, 5th of April. The position, Mr Speaker, is this, that the reason I did it was because of my grave concern about the procedure that is being employed under this motion, and in particular for the following reasons, which I will give briefly. First of all, it is well said in our constitutional authorities that justice is to be found in the interstices of procedure. What this means is that through procedure we are able to ensure that things are done that should be done, and based on conventions such as, for example, the reason for the rule, which is a fundamental basis of our constitutional arrangements. Mr Speaker, Standing Order 14 is quite clear. It gives precedence to government business. What has happened as a result of the procedures that have been followed is to impugn that and to substitute for it a completely different arrangement, which I describe as a constitutional revolution. It is not as it was described just now, a novelty, or indeed, as the member for Twickenham said the other day, nor is it a technical innovation. The problem, Mr. Speaker, is this. The reason why, and I go back to the reason for the rule and the reason for the standing order, is that government business takes precedence for one simple reason. The government is the government of this country, and it is given that opportunity by virtue of the decisions that are taken by the wishes of the members of the public as voters in general elections. That is the basis of our democracy. It is simply the fact that the decisions that are taken in a referendum, likewise, were taken by the members of the public as voters. So that for us to have, on the one hand, voted on the scale that was voted, and I don't need to go into that because we know that is the case, by such a significant majority, the reality is that to overturn, to invert the business of the House of Rules in this way, under this business motion, as indeed was the case the other day, seems to me to be utterly perverse. The reason why government business takes precedence is because of democracy. It is a fundamental question. And the second thing is that if one looks at the Referendum Act itself, that was decided by Parliament to give the decision to the British people, not to this House. And I have said repeatedly that we operate, and it is true, on the basis of parliamentary government, not government by Parliament. And if in a referendum by a sovereign act of Parliament we actually confer the right upon the British people to make that choice, it is not in terms of that Referendum Act, for which this House voted by 6-1, an opportunity for them to take back control in this context, having given the decision to the British people. So it is a very simple question, and it has happened only once before to my knowledge, and that you mentioned the other day, or somebody raised with you, Mr. Speaker, a precedent that went back to 1604. Now, as it happens, Mr. Speaker, as it happens, Mr. Speaker, there is another precedent, and it's in the 1650s, which is when this House became completely anarchic, and the different factions began to make decisions without reference to any government policy. Oliver Cromwell came down to this House, and he said to them, and look at the mess that we're in now and the anarchy that is now prevailing, with everybody in these indicative votes making different decisions for no good purpose. He came to this House and he said, very simply, you have been here too long for anything useful you may have done. Depart, I say, and in the name of God, go. That's what he said. He then brought in the bare-bones Parliament, Mr. Speaker. That collapsed as well, and they eventually ended up with a military dictatorship. Now, Mr. Speaker, I just simply say this. The members of Parliament, I will give way in a minute, the members of Parliament voted for the Referendum Act, as I said. They voted by 6-1. They voted for the Notification of Withdrawal Act, and then after that for the Withdrawal Act. And my right honourable and learned friend, the member for Rushcliffe, as I said quite often, himself voted for the third reading of the Withdrawal Act. So these indicative votes are just a means of trying to unravel the decision that was taken. That is the bottom line. I believe it is undemocratic. I think it's in defiance of our Constitution. It's in defiance of our procedures and the reason for the rule. And so, Mr. Speaker, I simply say this. As far as I'm concerned, these indicative votes are like a parliamentary bag of licorice all sorts, or rather humbugs.
Tom Bray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's because the government have lost the confidence of the House that this motion is before us. After 1,012 days of trying to find a solution, they have completely failed to do so. And this is day 2 of Parliament's attempt to find a cross-party solution to the Brexit dilemma. I hope that we are going to be successful on day 2, but of course if we're not, if we pass this business motion, as I hope we will do, we will also have day 3 on which to resolve this matter, and I hope we'll be successful, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Bernard-Jenke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I will agree with the honourable member for Carshalton and Wallington on one thing, which is this situation obviously does arise because the government has lost the confidence of the House on this issue, and I will be returning to that question later in my remarks. But I also want to return to the question raised by the honourable gentleman for Stoke-on-Trent Central, who very courteously and politely posed some questions to my right honourable friend, the member for West Dorset, because I think he raises perfectly reasonable questions for which he is having some difficulty holding my right honourable friend accountable. And I'm reminded of the words that, Mr. Speaker, that we heard on the 14th of February from my right honourable friend, when he said, and I quote, "The process of which we are now at the start will require the fundamental realignment between the civil service, government and Parliament. For a period, for this purpose, we will have to take on the government of our country." That is what my right honourable friend said. But this government, sitting to my left here, is not accountable to the honourable gentleman who's asking a question, because you can't table a question to this government. You can't ask this government to come and make a business statement, because, of course, it's not a government. It's just pretending to take over the role of government. And I don't wish to discuss Brexit in my remarks today. I want to just place on record some concerns I have, and I think many honourable and right honourable members on reflection should have, about the consequences of starting to run our country in this fashion. Passing this business motion would confirm that for the first time in more than 100 years, the government has lost explicit control over legislative business. The Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, which I chair, held an evidence session which underlined how extraordinary state of affairs this is. Conservative members of Parliament, who only 2 months ago voted for confidence in Her Majesty's government, do not appear to have confidence in its legitimate authority over the control of the timetable of this House. And this raises profound problems with this new procedure. Some seem to believe that this is some long overdue modernisation of an antiquated system of parliamentary government. In fact, it is turning our system on its head. A dramatic reversal of roles for government and Parliament. And this procedure may be well-intentioned, and I don't doubt for a moment my right honourable friend's sincerity, but it has been invented on the hoof, bypassing every means of reviewing the practices and procedures of this House. The Procedure Committee has not been consulted in any fashion at all. I give way to the honourable lady.
I'm very grateful to the right honourable gentleman for giving way. Some of us who are members of the Procedure Committee have sought to have further discussions about how to deal with these problems and have met some resistance. He seems to be wanting to limit the role of Parliament to that of the legislature. Now, I don't understand why he wants to import this American doctrine into our constitution with this very sharp division between the role of Parliament and the role of executive. That's just not the way the British Parliament is run or has been run.
About who imported whose model, because Montesquieu actually thought he was copying the British system when he created a United States Constitution that gives the President a legislative veto. Yes, a legislative veto, and that requires a two-thirds majority of the Congress to overrule it. I give way to my honourable friend.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend feel the same way if my other right honourable friend for West Dorset were proposing to use Wednesday to legislate in favour of a no-deal Brexit?
Well, very droll. but actually, rather miss the point of my opening remarks that I do not wish to discuss Brexit. All I would point out is that my honourable friend voted for the EU Withdrawal Act, which legislated for us to leave the European Union with or without a withdrawal agreement. He set that on the dispatch, onto the statute book with me. So, in that respect, parliamentary democracy has been served. I give way to my right honourable friend.
My friend keeps referring to me. Yeah, I voted for the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement 3 times. I accept this House by a large majority. It has set us on a course which I deeply regret to leave the European Union. I'm therefore trying to make some progress on what the House is now agreed upon as far as the form of that leaving the Union is concerned. The government is not prepared to give the House time to express an opinion on these matters or to reach an agreement on this matter. And as my honourable friend quite rightly said a moment ago, or implied, I strongly suspect that my right honourable friend on his feet will be taking a totally different view of this if no deal was being excluded by the government, if that by any chance had the majority of the House, though 400 people voted against it the last time it was raised.
The problem with this process of indicative votes, I would say to my right honourable learned friends, is that MPs are free to pick and choose policies they like. MPs are free to pick and choose whatever policies they like, but without any responsibility for what happens afterwards. And there should be a very obvious flaw in this process, and I am looking particularly at the opposition benches. Particularly in a hung parliament such as this, it is not unreasonable to suspect that individual honourable and right honourable members might have ulterior motives for supporting or opposing particular measures rather than voting just on their merits. After all, the House of Commons, this House, is a theatre within which different political parties compete for power, either by trying to avoid a general election or by trying to get one by collapsing the government. And amid this chaos, who is to be held accountable for what is decided in this way? I give way to my right honourable friend.
Very grateful to my honourable friend. Isn't it particularly the case where Parliament is trying to issue instructions to a government about an international negotiation? Only the government can negotiate on behalf of the United Kingdom. We can't have little groups of MPs who fancy their chances turning up in Brussels purporting to represent the UK. So this makes it a very difficult exercise when they're trying to influence a negotiation which only the government can handle.
I certainly agree with my friend. I have some criticism of the way this government has conducted its European policy. But it has to be said that the government cannot be held responsible for decisions it did not vote for or which improve impossible to carry out. And, well, I will give way to the right honourable member. I did note that he described the procedure as a Game of Thrones. I think that underlines how this procedure is open to ridicule, and no doubt he will carry on his ridicule because he wants a nationalist Scotland.
I'm just intrigued by his last comment, sir. He said he wants the government to be in charge of this particular process in negotiating Brexit. Can he tell us how he voted in the government's motion the last 3 times?
I don't think that's a secret. I'm surprised he hasn't gone to look it up for himself. But the problem is with last week's indicative votes have already discredited Parliament, because no single proposal was adopted by a majority. Sustained use of this procedure is already undermining trust, increasing alienation, and destroying the credibility of the institutions which historically have worked tolerably well. What is apparent is that the long-term effects of this constitutional upheaval are not a consideration of those who are forcing this upon us. There is no electoral mandate for such a dramatic constitutional upheaval. And under what circumstances would this experiment be repeated in the future, where a majority government, perhaps, does not have a majority on a particular issue? It is one thing for a minority governing party to help vote down a minority of the governing party to help vote down a government proposal, but it is something else extraordinary to combine forces with Her Majesty's official opposition to impose an entirely different government policy for which the government itself was not elected. I certainly give way to my right honourable.
These constitutional perambulations are very interesting, and I accept everything he says about the nature of these indicative votes. But if he and his friends have voted with the government for the last 3 times, we would now have Brexit by now.
I'm deliberately not going to become involved in that, but he knows my view that I do not believe the withdrawal agreement delivers Brexit. But what policy decisions are eligible in future to be made through this procedure? Why not decide taxation policy like this, or social security? And I well remember my right honourable learned friend for Rushcliffe, when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, with a stinging rebukes for those who voted down his policy on increasing VAT on fuel. But it's a different. Just imagine, it's worse. It's a bad thing for a government to lose a vote on a taxation measure in a budget. But just imagine handing over the entire budget proposals to the House of Commons to be voted on in this way. The vote to leave, Mr. Speaker, was in part to reverse the democratic deficit of the institutions of the European Union and to restore democratic national accountability. And whatever your view, Mr. Speaker, that should be uncontroversial. The EU's elected Parliament is blighted by low turnouts, and I doubt that any other than those with the who follow these, except those who follow these issues most minutely, could name with any certainty more than 1 or 2 of the candidates who's likely to be the next President of the European Commission, which is, of course, a legislative body. But in order to respond to this mandate expressed in the referendum, it cannot be right that we so corrode our own system of parliamentary government, making it less accountable to voters in elections and rendering its process more inaccessible and confusing. Of course, I give way to the right honourable lady.
I'm very grateful to the right honourable gentleman indeed. I'm afraid, being somewhat of a traditionalist in these matters, I have a good deal of sympathy with the points that are being made from that side. I dislike very much the necessity which has been forced on the House to take control of business from the government, because the government is simply not doing its business. But I also say to him that I would have much more sympathy for the complaint being made by him and various of his friends if they had ever seemed to notice the constitutional innovation practised many times by this Prime Minister of simply ignoring the fact that a division in this House of Commons was voted against, and it is being ignored.
Well, ignored is the operative word she uses, but obviously it is the practice of governments, and should always be the practice of governments, to respect the will of the House as expressed in a motion. But as Mr. Speaker himself has confirmed, a mere motion is merely an expression of opinion, and it is up to the government to decide how to respond to that opinion. And it underlines how, in our system, government proposes, Parliament disposes. Parliament does not take over the role of government, which is what is being proposed under this process. Of course, I give way to the right honourable member.
It's grateful, but the historic precedent is actually that when a government loses its major policy, or a financial policy, or in this case, its most significant policy, the government resigns. It doesn't hang about for a motion of no confidence, it automatically resigns. That's always been the historic precedent, and it's a bit of a surprise that it hasn't done so in this case.
Well, that takes me on to my very next point, which is so long as the Fixed Terms Parliament Act endures, it seems likely that minority governments would continue to be vulnerable to this usurpation of power, or this paralysis as he sees it, bringing some in this House more influence, but never to be held accountable or responsible for what happens as a consequence of decisions made in that way. The risk is that this process of disapplying standing orders, casting aside the processes of the House of Commons, seizing control from the government and threatening legislation passed against the government's wishes to bend the executive to the legislator's will, is here being used to remove a government from power but not from office. And this is a House which seems it will strike but not kill. And this new kind of instability is already having dire consequences for the rapidly diminishing confidence of our voters in our nation's democracy.
Has the honourable gentleman concluded his oration? He has. We're grateful to him. Mr Frankfield.
Speaker, I did want to speak, but the 30 seconds I think I could weave into my speech. Short one if you are mindful to call me later on.
Well, what impressive self-restraint. It may be a model that others should follow. Who knows? And I say that more in hope than expectation. Mr Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'm sorry not to be quite as brief as the honourable gentleman, but I want to speak to the specifics of the motion. First of all, I agree with my honourable friend, the member for Harwich and North Essex, that the constitutional innovation in this is deeply unsatisfactory. And as the honourable gentleman, the member for Carshalton and Wallington, rightly said, it is an indication that the House no longer has confidence in Her Majesty's government. The whole point of the government having control of the timetable is that that is an expression of confidence. I'm even quite sympathetic to the point made by the honourable gentleman, the member for the Rhondda. And it is the Fixed Term Parliaments Act that has created an element of constitutional muddle where we have a government that obviously doesn't contain or command the official confidence, but nonetheless carries on as if it did, and that we need to get to a situation where the business of the House and the government once more go together, because this approach is deeply unsatisfactory, because there is no means of holding anybody to account for it. That the motions here can be passed one way or another. They then go off to Europe to be discussed, if they are to be discussed, by people who don't believe in these motions, don't necessarily support these motions, and who may come back having failed, but because they haven't done it in a way the House might have liked, but the people who proposed the motions don't go out to discuss them with Brussels because they're not the government. And therefore having this approach leads ultimately to chaotic relationships between the legislature and the executive. But I also think, Mr Speaker, that this motion itself is an unsatisfactory motion. If we look at 1C, notwithstanding the practice of the House, any motion on matters that have been the subject of a prior decision of the House in the current session may be the subject of a decision. Well, Mr Speaker, as you pointed out to us, this is against the most ancient practice of the House, dating back to 1604. But it also seems to me that it's a considerable discourtesy to you personally, Mr Speaker, because on Thursday you ruled that the government could not bring forward a paving motion to allow it to bring its motion forward again. A decision, I think, that everybody in the House accepted and thought was reasonable. And therefore I think to have slipped through in this motion under your nose something that allows a paving motion for motions that have already been determined is a discourtesy. And if I had been as discourteous as that to you, Mr Speaker, I would not have the gall to move the motion standing in my name. Indeed, I would feel it necessary to make a public apology for such a shaming state of affairs. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
Can I thank him for giving way? Isn't his real objection not that Parliament is trying to balance control back from the government, but that his power has been seriously weakened by Parliament asserting its own authority and trying to have a say to find a way forward?
What a waste of question.
The shame is not that Parliament's trying to wrestle power from the government, but that Parliament is wrestling power from 17.4 million people who voted to leave. And the shame, Mr Speaker, is of people who stood on manifestos saying that they would respect the result of the referendum, and they did so when they spoke such, they did so with forked tongues. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm grateful to the honourable member for giving way. On the subject of shame and public apologies, I wonder if he might seize this opportunity to apologise for quoting, apparently approvingly, the leader of the AfD party, a far-right party in Germany this weekend.
Outrageous. Mr Speaker, I think it is reasonable to quote speeches made in the German Parliament. It is not as great a Parliament as this Parliament, or as noble a House as this chamber of the House of Commons, but nonetheless it is the chamber of a House of an important ally friend of ours. And what was said was extremely interesting. And just referring people to what has been said is not necessarily an endorsement. As the honourable gentleman may notice, I've just quoted from the text in front of us, not because I'm endorsing it, but because it's interesting and important. So the honourable gentleman perhaps should not jump to weird conclusions. But the other problem with this motion, Mr. Speaker, is the time that it allows for this debate. We have quite a number of motions before us, as we did yesterday, going up to not yesterday, the honourable lady from a sedentary position, right honourable lady from a sedentary position, quite correctly corrects me that it was at the end of last week. We have up to H to debate, and the format of this motion leaves from between 6 o'clock plus divisions, so 6:15, to 8 o'clock for this to take place. Now, this seems to me a very rushed approach to debating these important issues. When the government was in control of the order paper, it allowed more days for debate than this motion allows hours. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
Honourable member for giving way. If the honourable member were to conclude his speech and others would resist from debating in this part, we could get to the meat of the issue.
Congratulate the honourable gentleman. Had he not decided to intervene, I might have finished my comments, but now he has given me inspiration to carry on against this appalling motion that is fundamentally against the spirit of our Constitution. And I appeal to those who support this type of motion to have the courage of their convictions. If they really have no confidence in Her Majesty's government, let them vote that way. Let them go to their constituents and see if, standing as independents, how far they get. Let them see, as socialists, how many votes they will get. Let them see, as independents, how many votes they will get. They lack the courage of their convictions, and therefore they try and undermine the Constitution by subterfuge. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
On the matter of the courage of our convictions, just a few months ago, the honourable member voted that he had no confidence in the Prime Minister as the leader of his party, and then subsequently voted that he had confidence in someone he had no confidence in to lead his party, to lead the country. What kind of courage of convictions is that?
The honourable gentleman misses the rather obvious point. I have much more confidence in my right honourable friend, the member for Maidenhead, to lead the country, or indeed anybody sitting on these benches, than I do in his honourable friend, the member for Islington. It seems to me a really very straightforward choice, and of course I back a Tory against a socialist. Of course I'll give way to the right honourable lady.
There is an interesting point the honourable gentleman raises about, the honourable gentleman talked about courage of convictions. Could he like to tell the House why it is that a few weeks ago he voted against the government's withdrawal agreement, but on Friday he voted for it, and why he's entitled to a vote and to change his mind, but the people of this country are not allowed to change their minds and have a people's vote?
I'm deeply grateful to the right honourable lady for intervening. It is much appreciated because it allows me to point out to her that the right honourable lady, the foremost campaigner for a second referendum, the right honourable lady who favours votes at every opportunity, except when, having stood as a Conservative, she does not offer herself to her constituents, to them to decide whether they wish to have somebody who has turned their coat as their member of Parliament. So I think that, if the right honourable lady wishes to appeal for the Chiltern Hundreds, I will of course give way.
Order, just before the right honourable lady intervenes, we are in danger of straying somewhat from the narrow ambit of the business of the House motion, to which I hope we will return. Anna Soubry.
Well, I think it is important to record that, of course, the majority of people in Broxtowe did not vote Conservative. And like all honourable and right honourable members, I seek to represent all my constituents, as we should all do, putting them and our country before narrow sectarian party interests.
Let them decide.
Mr. Speaker, what was it that the late Earl of Beaconsfield said of Mr. Gladstone? A prolix rhetorician inebriated by the exuberance of his own verbosity. I would not dream of saying such a thing about the right honourable lady. Let me return to the motion in hand, which is discourteous to you, Mr. Speaker, does not allow sufficient time for debate, I won't give way again because others, with my apologies, is discourteous to you, limits time for debate, and is fundamentally against the Constitution.
Thank you very well, and then I'll call Kate Hoey next. Point of order, Mr. Tom Bray.
I wonder whether, in relation to the comments that the member has just made, whether he would like to correct the record. It's very clear from the tweet from the AFD that he retweeted that, in fact, he was endorsing the statement that had been made by that member of a far-right party in the German Parliament.
Well, the answer to that is that every member is responsible for the truth of what he or she says in the chamber. If a member feels that he or she has inadvertently erred, it is incumbent upon the member to correct the record. The honourable gentleman will have heard what the right honourable gentleman for Carshalton and Wallington has said and will make his own judgment as to its merit. Kate Hoey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have very grave concerns about the way that we're dealing now with our business and in terms of this business motion. I accept that we voted last week for today to have a period of indicative votes, further discussion. But I do find, Mr. Speaker, that the amendment moved by my honourable friend from Stoke Central really would have given us a chance as a House to decide whether we wanted to continue this process, which the member for West Dorset continues to do. I really do not think that we can continue to have a business motion that puts another day in, and then we do not get a chance to have that vote, Mr. Speaker. So I am concerned about that, and I am also concerned that I think many of my colleagues on this side of the House, I know that all of them, including the front bench, or particularly the front bench, aspire to be in government, and I think they should just remember a little bit. This may well be used when we're in government, and will we like to see that happening? So I also want to say that in a way these indicative votes, I am going to say, I will give way to the chair of my...
To ask the Honourable Lady if she agrees that one of the problems with these indicative votes is that when they're attached, as they intend to be by all accounts, to a bill which will then follow it, and that bill is to be put through the House of Commons in one day, without maybe one day in the House of Lords as well, for all I know. But the bottom line is, we do not know what those bills yet contain. It is inconceivable, is it not, that we should be presented with bills which will be rammed through the House of Commons on matters of such incredible importance without even seeing them.
Well, I think that's just further adding to my view that we should be able to vote whether we want another day or not after today's business. I do want to say that Parliament, and we have to remember here, and also for people watching, that Parliament actually did, and we have to say it over and over again, Mr. Speaker, but Parliament abrogated its responsibility to take this decision. It asked the people. It said, we will listen to whatever you say. And I don't care what anyone says. The dictionary definition to me of what leave means is very, very simple. And all these motions today, with the amendments and motions today, with the exception of the one tabled by the Right Honourable Member for Billericay, are all designed in some way or other to actually not allow us to leave in the way that people thought they were voting for when they voted on June the 23rd, 2016, because it was made very clear, and I don't want to go Mr. Speaker, I don't want to go into the details here, but it was very clear, and we all know that leave meant leaving all the institutions of the European Union. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm disappointed, and I would never question it, but I am disappointed we haven't had a vote on the amendment. I think that would have been sensible, and I hope that today people remember that the biggest majority in this House for anything to do with the European Union were the 498 votes that said we would leave with or without a deal. Thank you.
Greg Hands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I only need 30 seconds to make 2 points. First is this, that it does seem to me, Mr. Speaker, absolutely extraordinary that we're going to be having less than 3.5 hours of debate to debate incredibly important matters of whether we're going to enter into a customs union, be in the single market, a second referendum, or indeed revocation, which I find extremely unsatisfactory in the time that is left. But I won't eat further into that, Mr. Speaker. My second point is really this, Mr. Speaker. I think people will be puzzled when they look at the order paper, and notwithstanding the selection that you make, but the motion, for example, motion C in front of us today on the customs union, is precisely word for word motion J that was rejected by this House only 3 sitting days ago. And I think members of the public, Mr. Speaker, will be baffled as to how a 585-page government agreement is unable to come back for a further vote. Yet a word-for-word motion that was rejected only 3 days ago might be deemed as being suitable for debate today.
Tommy Shepherd.
Mr. Speaker, I wasn't intending to speak in this, but I want to do so briefly because, to be honest, I am astonished and not a little outraged at what is happening here today. I think members of the public watching this will be incredibly exasperated, not just at the fact that a hard-right faction in this Parliament are using lengthy speeches about procedure to try and prevent us getting to the debate, but that the government is acting in extreme bad faith towards this Parliament. Let us remind ourselves why it is we took control of the standing orders, which gives the government the right to set the agenda. It is because the government is incapable of using that right to move this process forward. They have done one of two things. They have either brought to this House a proposition which has manifestly failed to get a majority, completely unchanged, in the vain hope that the passage of time will allow them to browbeat their opponents into submission, or, even worse, they have filled our agenda with stuff that we do not need to discuss as a matter of urgency, and had the embarrassing situation that in a moment of national crisis, this House has finished its business early and we have been sent home with nothing to discuss. That is an outrage, and that is why this Parliament is taking control of the agenda in order that we can move the process forward, and I believe we will do so if we get the chance to get at it today. So I would hope, Mr. Speaker, we can take the vote, agree to take control into our own hands, and then make better use of it than this government is able to do.
Order. The question is the business of the House motion as on the order paper. As many as have that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Division! Clear the lobby.